Only a brief moment of ink on paper, yet those few seconds sealed a fate that would echo through the royal family for generations. Behind the closed doors of a private chamber inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles put his signature to an order without precedent, permanently taking from Meghan the title Duchess of Sussex. No cameras recorded it, no warning reached the public. No door remained open for compromise. The moment that document was lifted from the sovereign's desk, one of the most poisonous royal disputes of the modern age had crossed a line from which no one could return. Before we go further into what this signature truly means for the House of Windsor, take a second to subscribe so no chapter of this unfolding story slips past you. Charles did not rise once the ink had dried. He stayed in his chair, eyes fixed on the closing paragraph, as if some hidden mercy might still emerge from between the lines. The order had been issued under the direct authority of the sovereign, which meant it passed instantly into the official register of royal usage. Its reach went beyond the removal of a formal address. It cut through one of the final threads binding Meghan to the palace she had chosen to leave, and stripped away a name whose weight had traveled far beyond British soil. He read the final passage a second time, then pressed both palms flat against the wood of the desk. He knew what this act would do to Harry, and he knew the injury might never mend, but any further delay carried its own hazard. Each pause made the crown look indecisive. Each concession blurred the wall separating royal duty from private enterprise, and each new appearance of the Sussex name in the marketplace kept the wound bleeding. The stillness in the chamber grew heavier. Only a handful of trusted figures had known such a document was even being prepared, and even the senior members of the household had been kept beyond the door until the signature was complete. Charles had demanded absolute secrecy. A single leak could have unleashed lobbying, pressure campaigns, or attempts to soften the language before it took final form. He wanted the burden of this choice to fall on his shoulders and nowhere else. A further clause deepened the severity. Harry and Meghan would now be restricted in the way they could invoke their royal ties in future interviews, business ventures, philanthropic drives, and public engagements. The clause did not simply address what had already happened. It was built to shape what came next. Charles shut the folder, lifted his spectacles from his nose, and let out a long breath. "It is done," he said quietly. The aide waiting near the door came forward, took the document, and departed without uttering a syllable. The heavy door closed behind him, and with that soft click, private determination hardened into an act no one could reverse. Thousands of miles away in California, Meghan still believed the title was hers to hold. She had no notion that a single stroke of a pen had rewritten the vocabulary of every future press release, every reference in official records, and every public confrontation yet to come. But before that news would land on Californian soil, those closest to the decision would be forced to reckon with what the title had truly meant and what its erasure could destroy. Beneath the constitutional phrasing and the pressed royal seals stood 3 human beings caught inside a family injury that had never scarred over. Charles saw an institution under siege. Meghan saw a title she believed had been earned through hardship. Harry saw the last fragment of the life he had once shared with the people who raised him. The order carried the language of formality, but its meaning was searingly personal. A father had picked the crown. A wife stood on the edge of global humiliation. A son was about to feel discarded all over again. Charles carried the strain of both identities at once. As monarch, it fell to him to safeguard the credibility of the institution and to ensure that royal standing could never drift permanently apart from royal service. As a father, he saw clearly that lifting Meghan's title might shatter what fragile connections still remained between him and his younger son. The Sussex designation was never merely a label. It was a royal identity conferred through marriage, one that carried recognition, weight, and an enduring tether to the institution the couple had walked away from. Harry heard whispers before the official notice ever arrived. A former courtier, speaking through a secure encrypted line, told him the order had already moved past the stage of debate. The Duke's hand closed hard around the edge of a table beside him, and he asked the only thing that mattered. "Has he signed it?" The pause on the other end of the line said everything before words did. When the confirmation finally came, he dropped his gaze and said nothing at all. Meghan walked into the room a moment later and stopped the second she saw his face. She understood at once that something irreversible had taken place. Shock flickered briefly across her features, but it swiftly settled into composure. She asked to read every syllable of the palace communication, then scanned the opening lines while still standing. For her, this went beyond a loss of rank. It struck the very identity she had carried into every interview, every venture, every public engagement, and the entire life she had constructed far from Britain. William took no pleasure in the outcome. During a documented palace discussion, he had argued that royal titles could not remain protective shields against scrutiny while being wielded without the responsibilities that gave those titles their meaning. He believed hesitation would erode the crown's authority and set a hazardous precedent for future generations. Even so, he understood that Harry would not read his stance as institutional prudence, but as yet another wound inflicted by a brother. Camilla shared that fear. In a private exchange preserved in a household account, she cautioned Charles that the public would see only the single signature, not the months of pressure that had preceded it. The Queen Consort recognized that he would carry the blame in isolation, even though advisors, constitutional lawyers, and senior relatives had all left their fingerprints on the outcome. Harry felt the order was pointed at him just as much as at his wife. In his eyes, his father had picked institutional survival over any chance of mending what was broken. Yet the signature itself was not where this really began. Weeks earlier, a confidential recording from a private royal gathering had reached the king, and its contents had made further delay impossible. Every royal crisis holds within it a single moment that later feels destined, the instant when quiet resentment tips over into action that cannot be undone. For Charles, that instant arrived during a discreet reception at Windsor Castle, where a handful of carefully invited guests had assembled under a strict understanding that nothing spoken inside those walls would leave them. But before the clock struck midnight, an exchange between Meghan, Harry, and a senior palace representative turned years of quiet tension into something far more perilous. What unfolded in that room became the direct catalyst for the order signed several weeks later. Charles had let the strain drag on for years because a part of him still hoped that patience might one day carve a path back to his son. Palace officials had swallowed interviews, endured business projects, and absorbed repeated criticism, believing restraint could stop another public war from erupting. The Windsor gathering had been designed as a final test of that hope. It was a private reconciliation meeting, a closed session meant to resolve family conflict away from cameras, press statements, and external interference. Phones were handed over at the door. Aides remained outside the main room. Every guest was reminded that the discussion would stay locked within those walls. Meghan shifted the entire tone of the evening with a single sentence. During a conversation about her future public work, she stated plainly that Duchess of Sussex would remain her permanent global identity, no matter what the palace objected to, no matter what royal duties were involved, and no matter what fresh restrictions might be imposed. A senior courtier replied evenly that the title had been granted by the crown and could not exist beyond the authority that had created it. She pushed her chair back, turned her gaze directly toward Charles, and answered that the name now belonged to her public existence and could not simply be reclaimed. Harry stepped in before anyone else in the room could react. He placed himself between his wife and the courtier and accused the palace of trying to erase his family while pretending to offer peace. His voice climbed. Meghan refused to temper her words. The Duke insisted that the title represented their marriage, their children, and the entire future they had built outside Britain. Within minutes, a meeting created to rebuild trust had unraveled into the exact confrontation everyone had dreaded. Several days later, Charles listened to the exchange again through a confidential security recording that had been made to log potential threats and safeguard those present. He froze the audio at Meghan's declaration and sat alone in silence for many long minutes. To him, this was no longer a misunderstanding about protocol. Royal honors were distinctions granted by the sovereign, and her statement carried the weight of a direct challenge to whether the monarch still held authority over them. Another discovery pushed him closer to the edge. A documented commercial briefing had reached the palace, revealing plans for a substantial international venture built visibly around the Sussex title. Waiting now came with a deadline. Once the project was publicly announced, any move against it would appear vindictive and weak. Charles called Harry to him before that proposal could go any further. He would extend one last compromise, but not through legal channels or through the mouths of advisors. The final opportunity would play out face to face, between a wounded father and a son, already convinced that the palace had chosen the crown over him. No aides sat between them. No cameras waited beyond the door. When Harry stepped into the king's private sitting room, he found only his father, 2 glasses of water left untouched, and the unsigned order resting inside a dark folder. Charles had summoned him for one final exchange before making the decision permanent. What followed carried none of the choreography of a formal royal meeting. It was a collision between a sovereign guarding the institution and a son demanding that his wife be treated as family rather than as a hazard. Charles motioned for him to sit, but the Duke remained on his feet. He already knew what lay inside that folder. The order was a formal command issued under the monarch's authority, capable of altering how Meghan's title was recognized and applied within royal life. The king weighed each word carefully. He said the designation could not go on suggesting royal authority, while the couple continued to reject the duties, the limits, and the public accountability that gave that authority meaning. Harry's composure cracked almost at once. He accused his father of punishing Meghan for refusing to stay quiet. He said the palace had turned every disagreement into a loyalty exam and every criticism into an assault on the crown. To him, this had nothing to do with rules. It was about humiliation. Charles responded with a quieter kind of anger. The issue, he said, was not silence, but accountability. Private family suffering had been carried again and again into interviews, statements, and business ventures, placing the monarchy under relentless pressure. He reminded his son that every royal title carried institutional weight, and that weight could never be exercised without responsibility. Harry reached out and pulled the folder toward him. He read the opening sentence, then set the folder down so abruptly that one of the water glasses trembled against the surface. The small sound echoed through the room. He demanded to know if the decision had already been made. Charles offered one final option. Meghan could keep a private, personal connection to the Sussex name, but she would have to stop using it commercially and in formal public branding. The compromise would preserve a private thread while cutting it away from royal authority. It was narrow, fragile, and unmistakably final. Harry refused. He argued that accepting such terms would let the palace continue to dictate his wife's identity long after they had walked away from royal life. His voice climbed again, but his father did not raise his own to meet it. Charles closed the folder. His moment of breaking came without a shout. He told his son that a refusal left him with no responsible course but one. The words struck harder for being spoken so gently. Harry walked toward the door, paused, and turned as if a final sentence might rescue what was left. Nothing came. The door closed behind him, and the king was left beside the unsigned order, knowing the family confrontation had failed. From here, the decision would pass into the machinery of royal authority and into the hands of those who believed the crown could no longer afford tenderness. The order carried only a single signature, but the weight behind it had been gathered from every quarter of the royal establishment. Senior advisors feared the Sussex title had grown into a competing brand. Constitutional officials feared that continuing ambiguity would erode the crown's hold over its own honors. William saw an unresolved threat looming over the monarchy's future. And through all these legal arguments and strategic warnings walked a visibly worn Charles, weighing whether protecting the institution truly required sacrificing the last fragile hope of peace with his son. William paused in the corridor outside the council chamber before the decisive meeting began. He unfolded the notes he had prepared, read them once more, and struck through a line he worried might sound too personal against Meghan. He wanted the distinction to remain sharp. A royal title was not a family surname. It was an honor bestowed by the sovereign, tying its bearer to public service and to the reputation of the crown. To him, this had always been about responsibility rather than revenge. Behind the closed doors, the pressure sharpened. Constitutional advisors, communications officials, and senior household figures had put together a documented recommendation, warning that continued uncertainty could no longer be tolerated. Each interview or business venture that bore Sussex branding carried the risk of implying royal endorsement where none existed. That risk mattered because the public might struggle to distinguish private commerce from the authority of the monarchy itself. Future heirs, they warned, would inherit an institution unable to police its own identity. When William's moment came, he weighed his words with care. He said future generations could not be handed a crown in which royal designations moved freely of royal duty. The heir did not ask for humiliation. He asked for a boundary strong enough to withstand the next crisis. Camilla remained restless. In a private exchange later documented in a household record, she asked Charles whether a permanent removal would close every door to reconciliation. The queen consort warned that an institutional victory could turn into a lasting family defeat. He heard her clearly, but he also understood that endless compromise had only deepened the wound. A darker piece of intelligence then shifted the discussion. The first draft had proposed only a temporary suspension, but advisors had reviewed plans for continuing international ventures built around the Sussex identity. Their verdict was blunt. Temporary limits would invite repeated skirmishes and allow the conflict to flare back to life every time a new project surfaced. Charles listened as others spoke about his family in the language of risk, precedent, and control. Then he raised one hand, and the room fell silent. The king declared that no document would be signed unless the responsibility rested plainly and openly on his own shoulders. A second provision was added. Future palace communications would no longer refer to Meghan by the Duchess designation, giving the change a symbolic reality as well as a formal one. The final version was placed before Charles, while a secure palace team readied simultaneous notifications for Harry, Meghan, senior royals, and major broadcasters. The moment the signature was added, strategy became reality, and in California, the first message reached its destination before Meghan had any chance to brace herself. The message came without any ritual. Meghan opened it expecting another formal quarrel from London, but the very first line stopped her in place. The title she had worn for years was no longer hers. There was no temporary restriction, no window for review, no offer to negotiate. Harry watched her read in silence as disbelief tightened into anger. The palace had not simply challenged their public identity. It had redrawn the line separating them from the monarchy for good. Meghan stood at the kitchen counter and reached the passage announcing permanent removal. She stopped, went back to the start of the paragraph, and read it again more slowly. The official notification was a direct communication from the palace confirming how the crown would now record and recognize the change. That mattered because the Duchess designation appeared throughout planned announcements, charitable material, formal invitations, and commercial branding. Erasing it threatened both her public position and the framework of projects already assembled around the Sussex identity. The silence broke with a single question. She lowered her phone and turned to Harry. He actually signed it? She turned away before he could answer. The formal wording stung, but the personal betrayal cut far deeper. In her mind, Charles had not simply approved a restriction. He had chosen to erase the very identity his family had once granted her. Harry felt his anger climb alongside his guilt. His failed meeting with the king had shut the last route to compromise, and he knew it. He feared his wife would now see him as helpless against the very institution he had promised she could leave behind. Part of him wanted to place all the blame on the palace, yet another part recognized that his own hesitation had brought the crisis to their door. Meghan refused to appear defeated. She called in her closest advisors, placed the communication in the center of the table, and instructed them to review every line before any public statement went out. Her team quickly identified the most urgent damage. A major media project featuring prominent Sussex branding had been scheduled for release within days. The timing of the order shattered the launch before the world even knew it existed. Tension sharpened when Meghan asked whether Harry had known that permanent removal was possible. He waited only a handful of seconds before answering, but those seconds changed everything. She read the truth in his silence. He had known the danger was real, and he had chosen hope over warning her. Inside the palace, the consequences spread just as fast. Staff received fresh guidance on how to address her. Official pages were updated. Senior royals were told to hold their tongues until Charles released a written statement. The king's own communication would explain the choice without opening any door to renegotiation. Meghan dismissed her advisors and stayed alone with Harry. Neither of them shouted. Neither reached for a defense. The order had torn open a wound inside their marriage as much as between two households. But in the quiet after the anger, they faced a choice weightier than any title. Fight the monarchy again, or finally step past it entirely. Hours after the advisors had gone and every public statement had been put on hold, Meghan and Harry sat alone. No palace officials stood between them. No lawyers were shaping their words. Their phones lay in another room, out of reach of headlines, warnings, and demands. The order still rested on the table, but the battle around it had shifted. This was no longer only about Charles, about protocol, or about royal control. It was about who they would become without the identity they had spent years defending. Harry sat across from his wife long after midnight and waited for her to speak. Meghan eventually said that the removal felt like a public erasure. The title had stood for the life she had entered, for the sacrifices she believed she had made, and for the legitimacy others had questioned from the very beginning. A royal designation was more than a social marker. It was a formal identity tied to the monarchy and recognized through official use. Losing it meant that every future appearance would carry with it the proof that the palace had withdrawn that that connection. She looked at him and asked for the truth without softening her voice. Harry admitted that permanent removal had been on the table after his last meeting with Charles. He had known the danger was real, but he could not bring himself to say the words aloud. He apologized for allowing hope to stand in the place of honesty. He had wanted to believe his father would step back. Instead, his silence had left her defenseless. The anger eased, but the ache did not. Meghan admitted that another long public war could swallow their family and turn every private wound into a spectacle for strangers. Harry offered a harder confession in return. Fighting the palace, he said, had kept him emotionally tethered to the very institution he claimed to have escaped. Every attack, every defense, every interview pulled him back toward the same doors he had walked away from. Meghan then made the choice that changed everything. They would not launch an immediate legal challenge or unleash a media counterattack. They would release a measured statement, one that acknowledged the order without surrendering their dignity. This was not forgiveness. It was control. Harry opened the prepared draft and found a page filled with accusations aimed at Charles, William, and the palace officials. He read the opening lines, lifted the sheet, and tore it clean in half. The gesture ended more than a paragraph. It signaled that every future injury would no longer be dragged out for public consumption. Charles received quiet notice through a secure message before the statement went out. The king read it in solitude and briefly closed his eyes. Their restraint had not restored his trust, but it had spared the crisis from becoming even more ruinous. The final statement appeared under their personal names, cleansed of royal language and open defiance. A new chapter had opened without the identity they had once fought to keep. But beyond the walls of their home, the world was already transforming one royal signature into a global verdict. By the time the sun rose over London, the private royal order had become a global argument. Broadcasters cut into scheduled programming. Palace correspondents assembled beneath gray skies. Supporters called the king decisive. Critics condemned the act as cruel and vindictive. Yet one image captured the crisis more powerfully than any panel discussion. A newspaper front page showing Meghan's portrait beneath 4 enormous words, no longer a duchess. In a single morning, a family injury had become a worldwide referendum on monarchy, identity, and power. A crowd formed outside Buckingham Palace around a newsstand displaying Meghan's face with her removed title crossed out in red. Some raised their phones, others argued openly on the pavement. The Duchess designation was not simply a social label, it was a formal royal identity linked to the crown and recognized through official use. Its disappearance mattered because it revealed that the order had moved beyond private frustration and into public reality. A major broadcaster called it the most serious royal title dispute since Harry and Meghan had stepped away from official duties. The report explained that the decision had permanently redrawn their relationship with the monarchy. Supporters said Charles had finally defended the boundaries of the crown. Critics saw something colder, a mighty institution humiliating a woman who had already walked away from royal service. William watched the coverage with the sound muted. His jaw tightened as commentators described him as a driving force behind the decision. He had pressed for clarity, but the signature belonged to his father. He knew public anger rarely respected that distinction, and he feared the story would harden Harry's belief that his own brother had helped close the palace doors forever. Camilla folded a newspaper shut before Charles could reach for it. She told him not to read the personal attacks, but the king had already seen the headlines calling him heartless, weak, and vindictive. The queen consort reminded him that public fury would eventually cool. He answered softly that family judgment might not. Meghan and Harry's restrained statement altered the tone precisely because it carried no accusations. Broadcasters abandoned their forecasts of instant warfare and began asking whether the couple had chosen independence over retaliation. Their silence deprived the crisis of another explosion, yet it also made the palace's action feel even more definitive. Official digital records changed within hours. Meghan's title vanished from formal references, public pages, and future naming guidance. The order was no longer an abstract document tucked inside royal offices. It could be seen in every altered line. Charles walked to a palace window and heard distant voices from the crowd beyond the gates. He did not lift his hand. He understood that any gesture might read as triumph, and this decision had brought no triumph at all. Public opinion remained divided, but the private struggle had reached its final act. The title would not return. Once the noise of the headlines quieted, the family would still be left with the permanent consequence and the emotional truth no official document could conceal. The order produced no victor. Charles preserved the authority of the crown but forfeited another piece of the bond with his son. Meghan lost a title, but received a final separation from the institution that had both shaped and wounded her. Harry could no longer pretend that reconciliation would ever restore the life he had left behind. When the arguments had fallen silent, the true verdict was unmistakable. The monarchy had defended its boundaries, but every person tangled in the crisis had paid for that certainty. Charles returned to the room where he had signed the document. He paused beside the same desk, laid one hand on the closed folder, and asked an aide to remove it from his sight. The Royal Archive was the secure repository where important crown records were preserved for history. Sending the order there confirmed that the decision was permanent. It would not linger nearby as a weapon, a warning, or an open invitation to reopen the dispute. The king did not regret shielding the monarchy's authority. Royal identity carried obligations because titles bound private individuals to public service, to national trust, and to the reputation of the sovereign. Yet he understood the human cost. Harry would never again look at his father without recalling that signature, and no constitutional argument could rebuild the distance it had created. Meghan faced her new reality without collapsing into it. She approved public materials bearing her personal name alone, and told her team that future work would have to stand without any borrowed royal weight. The title was gone, but her voice remained. For the first time, she could no longer gauge her influence by way of a palace designation, and that absence slowly began to feel like a kind of freedom. Harry reached his own difficult conclusion. He accepted that protecting his wife and children required building a life no longer touched by palace approval, inherited standing, or dreams of returning home. He had spent years battling the institution, while still secretly waiting for it to welcome him back. That illusion was finished. William looked toward the future without celebration. He knew institutional clarity had been restored, but he also understood what happens when a family quarrel is elevated into a constitutional act. The crown had strengthened its boundary while weakening the people standing behind it. Camilla later spoke to Charles in a private conversation documented in a household account. She told him history might remember the order as strength, but the family would always remember it as loss. The queen consort waited for a reply. He gave none. There would be no reversal, no renewed negotiation, no restoration. Meghan moved forward without the title, but not without dignity. Harry lost the illusion of return, but gained a clearer road ahead. Charles secured the crown while accepting that sovereignty could never mend a broken family. The order was locked away. Both households continued on beneath separate identities, and the battle ended for good. The monarchy survived stronger in authority but undeniably poorer in family. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.